Hello, well, this is Dr. David Mastock talking about reciprocity.com. The E is spelled with a 3. And this is a platform where I believe that everybody should be able to get the feedback, skills, and just wonder to be able to become a prolific writer and scholar. I think this is a really wonderful thing to be able to do this and to be part of it. So in this particular video, I really wanted to talk about what are the pros and the cons of going to grad school, and particularly getting a PhD or a graduate master's research thesis, or doing a master's thesis in some sort of research degree, right? So there you could go do a graduate degree in something that is kind of more on the practical side, like a nursing degree or a MBA, for example, a master's of accounting, for example. This is probably not going to be as relevant for you versus going into graduate school. So I'm a professor of innovation strategy and entrepreneurship, and this is part of my Thesis Help series where I'm just trying to help out all graduate students and people that are thinking about going and getting a graduate degree and sort of weighing the different pros and cons, for example, in this particular video, so that you can make a much more wiser and more effective decision. So what are some of these pros and cons of going to graduate school, particularly getting a PhD or a research degree, right? So I'm going to start off with the pros and get into the cons, and then, maybe give you a couple of thoughts of what I would have done given if I would have done this a second chance, of whether I actually would go into graduate school again. So what are some of the pros? First of all, what's really cool is you're going to see the world in a different way beyond what you have seen in the past. It's going to rock your world, particularly when you start understanding how the world works in different ways, whatever your subfield is, whatever you're interested in, whether it's chemistry, physics, or, in my field, I'm in a business school, so I teach organizational theory, how people actually behave, how, sort of psychology, as well as how people understand organizations, how you can structure organizations. And it really does blow your world when you first start learning about this kind of stuff. It's really fascinating, super interesting stuff. You're like, oh my God, I never thought that the world kind of worked in that way. I had no idea how it all sort of fit together. And it really does. You go through many different mind flips throughout the PhD process. You're going to be it's going to feel really cool. The second thing that's important, it does affect your social status. Now, as a PhD student, your social status is extremely low because you're kind of in this limbo land, right? Or if you're a graduate student, you're in this limbo land where you're not really working. And so you can't tell anybody what you're doing, and you're not really, a productive member of society, and you're not really, working your way up in any sort of way in the graduate school system. So you feel very sort of low status, and to be honest, you kind of are at that moment because you're still learning and developing things. But then there's this weird moment when you do get the degree, and all of a sudden you go from being a graduate student to this really low graduate student to all of a sudden you have a PhD, and it's just kind of like this flip. And the flip takes probably about 6 months to a year before you start realizing that, and you start realizing the status that you accumulated along the way. And so you actually start having more status, and that's probably an important thing. That's one major reason why people actually do PhDs, is to actually get some sort of status. A PhD behind your name does construe some status effects that happens because of that. And status is where people bestow onto you some sort of, and this is sort of from a sociological perspective, this is where people bestow onto you some sort of degree of, they understand they estimate what your performance is in terms of your overall performance based on these sort of external signals of credibility. So for example, getting a PhD and reward or something like that gives you extra status. That might actually get you resources through a different way. They might sort of bestow onto you different resources and stuff like that you would never have thought. The third thing that's really cool, particularly if you want to do a PhD and become a professor, for example, you can live and find jobs in college towns that are normally really difficult to actually live in. And this is one of the major reasons why I actually chose to do a PhD myself, was because of the locational advantages that you do get, right? So if you just have a undergraduate degree and you go and work, you have to go to where sort of corporations work, right? Or where companies and businesses are. And generally, they're in very large cities. And generally, there is a very hot job market there for these kind of people, right? So those large cities have all sorts of negative, what are called negative externalities, things like traffic congestion, lots of people being all around, pollution and things like that. And I wanted to actually live in a college town. I currently do live in a college town, Tallahassee in Florida. And it's a really wonderful thing to get there. The problem is not a lot of people actually make it into a college town with a graduate degree. It's really hard to get into a college town. The other thing that you can get into is not in the university system, but also as well as getting into, sometimes there's some research firms and stuff like that that are located in college towns. So there is a little bit of a locational advantage that you can get with that. The other one that's really, really cool, so this is the fourth thing, is that you do get considerable sort of flexibility in what you choose to do. So you can research whatever you want. You could do whatever you want at all. You can go into any lab. You can, particularly in the social sciences and what we do, you can research any particular topic if you want to go. And this is a really cool thing. You can see I have an older video on this. It's sort of figuring out what your bucket list is as a graduate student. But you can go, if you want to, you can go into Darfur, for example, or Sudan, and research what's going on there and try to understand what's going on there. You can also go into sort of luxury places. You can research, how do Wall Street people sort of behave, and then I'll take you to Wall Street. You can also research things like maybe you want to research how cruise ships navigate their organizational structure, or maybe resorts sort of develop their organizational structure, and that will take you to these particular locations. You can go on sort of you can do research at these particular locations, which tend to be really luxurious. So you can choose whatever you want to do. You can choose to study everyday life and see how people sort of go through mundane life, for example, and which is really cool to have that flexibility. A lot of people don't have that flexibility. That is a very large plus in doing that. The other thing is you have the ability, the flexibility to kind of work wherever. So it's not necessarily just the location in terms of where you live, but you can work. I work at home often. You can see here I'm working at home. You can also, it doesn't matter where you're doing, or you could work in a coffee shop. It doesn't matter. So it's really kind of interesting. And so this actually creates a lot of different cons, right? So it's kind of, there's some difficulties that rest on this. So, the first of all, sort of related to that particular issue, is that you feel a lot of aimlessness. So you kind of don't really, you're kind of restless. You don't really have a place to be, which is a really important thing of organizations. There's a lot of research on this, that you need a place, you need to sort of fit in with a structure or something like that. And you actually don't have a lot of that goes on with a graduate degree. You don't know where you fit in. And one of the other things I was going to point out, this is a critical issue, and I think this is the number one issue. On the plus side of seeing the world in a different way, you also see the world in a different way, which is a really negative thing with interacting with people and developing a relationship with people, because you fundamentally understand the world in a different way, and it takes a lot to actually get to that point. It's a really high hurdle to get to that point, to understand the world in that way. You feel very isolated in a lot of times. You feel very, you just don't know how to interact with different people. In fact, you'll go through a stage, if you do a PhD, which is a long degree, that you just feel very, very socially isolated. You feel like you don't really fit in with anybody, because you're kind of really on your own at that moment. It changes as you become a professor, because lots of people come talk to you and stuff like that. So it's a little bit better in terms of acting around people and stuff like that, but you still feel very socially isolated. It's kind of the same way that if you are running some large major corporation, right? Everybody comes and talks to you and interacts with you, but you're still kind of socially isolated because you're part of, running things. So you're kind of the boss, in an organization like that. And it's harder to develop that long-term relationships and stuff like that from that kind of perspective. And it's the same thing when you do a PhD. It becomes this really weird thing where, you don't, and I had this conversation years ago when I first started out, And, it's kind of like, you're kind of like a Debbie Downer sometimes when you are at a party, for example, because you do know better in some of these things, and you don't want to be that person that knows everything and go into all this detail and stuff like that, which for some people is really interesting, but most people, they just want to talk about the weather, or talk about sports or stuff like that. So it is a really kind of isolating thing in that sort of way. The other thing that's really important, and I sort of pointed this out already, is this aimlessness that you feel. You feel very uncertain often. You don't know where you're going, and there's this kind of thing called uncertainty and ambiguity. Uncertainty is you sort of understand where to kind of go, but you don't know what the particular probabilities on the things that you're going to choose, what is the best thing to choose. Ambiguity, on the other hand, is you don't really understand what is the best way to go with something. And you really feel those two components when you're doing a PhD. You have no idea what you're doing along the time. You have a lot of research to borrow on and to look at, and what other people are doing. You can rely on your supervisors and stuff like that, your advisors and stuff like that. But at the same time, you feel very isolated because you're making something up. It's completely new, and that is the purpose of doing research, is you're investigating something new that somebody else hasn't done before. And that sort of pushes you in this really weird feeling, this really weird area where you just don't know what to do. And so a lot of people actually have really different responses to this. Some people get grumpy and very miserable and go through a bout of depression. Depression is extremely common with doing a PhD or a graduate degree, so you have to be very careful of that. Some people actually go through kind of the opposite, where they work too much. They don't really have, because they don't have boundaries, and they don't sort of understand what the boundaries are when they're working. They can either work way too much and work all the time, and you see that they'll work 7 days a week, and they'll do that for a couple of years. And often, most of those people, the vast majority of those people that do that, they burn out. They actually, because they don't have boundaries, they burn out. And they don't last that long. Some people, the odd, really strange person, can do that for years and years and years and years and years. And they're highly, highly productive. But most people can't do that. They need sort of boundaries. And then there's the opposite, which is probably most people, is they don't work enough, and they don't know, that because there's no sort of immediate outcomes and stuff like that, they don't necessarily work as much as they should in the long run. And so their performance suffers, right? Because it's kind of really ambiguous. You don't know where you're going. And you just don't know really what to do along the way. So if you can't really deal with uncertainty along the way, that it's probably not the best career for you to choose that. The other one is the financial costs, and I was really kind of duped in a lot of different ways. I thought it was going to be much more financially lucrative. Because I did my own, I'm an engineer by training. I went to business school and stuff like that, understood sort of doing what's called the net present value. You could do a financial calculation. So I calculated financial cost and looked at the returns of being able to do a PhD, and I chose one that was pretty lucrative, right? So strategy is what my background is, and I did finance, a bunch of research or a bunch of courses in finance and economics, thinking that was going to boost my financial perspectives or outlook and things like that. But the problem is I didn't account for many different things because of this uncertainty. So it took me a lot longer, and I thought it was going to be 4 years. I'm going to be in and out. It ended up taking me about 7 years by the time I actually found a job and was working in academia. That was after doing a master's degree, by the way, which I actually went through pretty quick. But there's all these different things along the way, and so you end up running out of money. And then I did my own financial calculation a few years ago, and I realized my break-even point was going to be when I was in my 50s of actually choosing this versus staying in a sort of more stable career. So I was an engineer, right? So staying in a more in engineering, for example, would have produced probably much better returns in the long run. So you have to trade that off and be very, very cognizant that because there's all this uncertainty, you don't know how long things are going to take, that essentially the financial costs are very, very high, no matter which field you are in. I'm probably in one of the more lucrative fields there is to do a PhD, but still the financial costs are far more than what I thought they were going to be. So you have to be very, very cognizant of that before you make that choice. And you choose to do a PhD. Now looking back, I should have chosen to do a PhD, and I did to some degree because you love what you do and you're interested in what you're doing. So coming to my own own personal thoughts and what you should actually do and think about based on these different pros and cons. Now, would I have done a PhD over again, given all of this information? Now, given the financial costs and whatnot, I probably would not have done that, because the financial cost is much more, it's just financially not worth it. However, if you look at the non-financial, non-pecuniary or non-monetary benefits that you get, like flexibility, for example, being able to live in a college town, talking to really interesting, smart people that you would never talk to, or you would be sort of locked out of that culture. That kind of thing is really, really interesting, and does provide a tremendous amount of benefit that does sort of compensate for some of the financial cost that it did take you to get there, or the financial burden of trying to get you there. But, given from somebody, I did grow up in a really small town, and I kind of worked my way up. My parents, I was the first one in my family to go away to university, and there was 5 kids, right? And this is on multiple sides of my family. So it was pretty unusual to do this kind of thing, and I had to make very large costs. And there's kind of the idea of going through different social strata, because I came from very blue collar family and everything, which was really wonderful. It was an amazing family. I'm not saying any sort of thing like that. That it was. I couldn't have asked for anything more, but it's a really interesting thing to go across and to go into different, into an area in society, I guess, that is completely different, and that I would never have imagined myself here and sort of pursuing these pursuits. But, that is also the cool thing, is a sort of, you see things in different ways and whatnot. So I would, to some degree, I would really consider suggesting that, yes, you have to really weigh the financial costs, and you really have to want to do what you're doing, and you have to acknowledge that you're going to go through all these weird emotional journeys and stuff like that along the way, for a number of different reasons. Not just because you're working on something that's difficult and tough, but you do learn a lot about yourself as well. But then you're also going through all of these kind of weird stages in life, and going through all these weird transitions in terms of social status and social strata. And that happens in every work environment, by the way. I'm not sort of saying one way or the other. It just really does happen in work environments. But it's something to really consider and to think about. And you should really take a very cognizant and careful decision on pursuing that. You should also know why you're doing what you're doing. I think that's a critical thing, is to make sure you're very, very clear on why you're actually doing a PhD, to make sure, or a graduate degree of any sort, to make sure that you're not just doing it just because somebody told you to, or because it is, something that you just do for whatever reason. That is not the case. You should be doing a PhD because you truly love the material, and you are doing, it's almost like a sacrifice, and it's often viewed as a sacrifice. In fact, the model that the PhD is sort of based off is sort of based off of monks and religious orders and stuff like that from hundreds of years ago, right? So it's very much this, you're giving up something, there's sort of financial rewards in terms of getting enlightenment rewards, I guess, is the issue, or the degree, or the thing that you would get and benefit. So just be very cognizant of that when you're making a choice to do a PhD. Looking back, given now, without the financial cost of actually getting to the stage where I'm getting to, without any of that sunk cost or anything like that, it's a great career. I really love what I'm doing. I love the school that I'm at. The institution that I'm at is wonderful. The people are wonderful. I get to talk to really smart people every day, but there is a large cost to get there, and you have to weigh that and think about that as you get through the process. And just acknowledge it's going to be costly, and you're making this for a personal choice or a family choice that is beyond something that you would do sort of for a financial, rational sense or whatnot. Now, if you're coming from another country, for example, and you are doing something from, if you're going from a third world country, well, not, a developing country, I don't like that term, but more of a developing country that's still kind of growing, that is sort of progressing, and you're using this as a way to advance your career. It often is a really great way to advance your career in terms of getting into a Western country, for example, because you get legitimacy of doing the degree, and then that allows you to get jobs in the job market as well. So that's all I wanted to say. If you're interested in these videos, make sure you do give me a thumbs up with this particular one. You can watch the other ones and see what I'm doing with the Reciprocity Project. It is aimed at helping out graduate students and scholars around the world. I think it's really fun and cool to be able to do that. So I do appreciate you that you're listening to this video. Thank you so much, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you on the next video. Bye.